Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Rosen. I'm a full-time software engineer, but I'm an indie game dev on the side. My latest project is a game called Worm Sign, which is a short, meditative rhythm game where you play as this giant sandworm roaming across the desert. Prior to that, my previous game is a competitive card game called Abbott's Gamble that has this kind of gothic Game Boy aesthetic. Both of those games are playable in your browser for free, either on itch.io or on my personal site at joshuarosen.games. And since both projects were solo indie game dev efforts, I thought it would be fitting to talk about my favorite solo indie dev and one of my biggest inspirations when I started doing indie game dev myself a few years ago. So for this episode of Side Quests, I'm going to be talking about Return of the Obra Dinn, a game developed by Lucas Pope. So right off the bat, I have to be clear, I will not be spoiling this game at all. It's a mystery game, it's a deduction game, so it's important that if you like those kinds of games, you should probably just play it. I'm going to talk about the basic setup of the story. I'll talk about the gameplay mechanics, but all the narrative beats will be unspoiled, so you can experience it for yourself. So for the basic setup of the game, you play as an insurance adjuster for the East India Company in 1807, and this merchant vessel called the Obra Dinn has suddenly reappeared after going missing 5 years ago, and it's up to you to determine the identities and different causes of death for the 60 crew members that were scheduled aboard that ship. To help you figure that out, you have this pocket watch called the Memento Mortem, which lets you see a freeze frame of the moment of someone's death. And you have to use this kind of magical device to figure out the narrative of what happened to the Obra Dinn and what happened to all its crew members. So the very first thing that I need to talk about, and the first thing that I'm sure many people notice when they see the game, is the incredibly unique art style, which I absolutely love. Like I mentioned earlier, this game was solo developed by Lucas Pope, whose previous game was the breakout success Papers, Please. And he's talked in interviews about how his first computer was a Mac Plus, and that for Return of the Obra Dinn specifically, he wanted to capture that one-bit detailed black and white look of old Mac games, but in a real-time first-person game that looks a bit like grittier and less cartoony than some of those older games. And what you end up with is this detailed rendering of an 18th century merchant vessel using modern graphic techniques and specifically constructed to have this black and white pixely aesthetic with these different like dithering patterns for the shading. There's like rain effects and dust clouds that are all expressly made with the viewer being able to distinguish like individual black and white pixels. It creates this really striking effect that, clearly had a lot of care put into it to make things legible and interesting in this art style. And one of the really cool things about this game, for someone like me who's an aspiring game dev, or for anyone who has an interest in game dev, is that Lucas Pope wrote a devlog while he was working on this game. And he has a lot of content out there discussing and detailing a bunch of the different steps to this process that he went through to create things like that unique graphical style. That devlog was started in 2014, and it's still available to read today, 10 years later, thankfully. Lucas Pope goes into a bunch of really insightful technical details on, exactly how the shader passes worked to get that style, how he represented things like a blast of smoke from a gunshot and got it to look consistent and readable, with that overall style. And there's lots of other interesting posts that he makes describing things like the audio setup for the different rooms in the ship, the character design workflow, the buoyancy of the ship in the water, the footsteps and head bob of the player, all these little details that you don't even really think about when you're playing the game, but that as a solo dev, you have to consider and take the time to implement. And all of them do take time, but they kind of add up to form this, you know, greater than the sum of its parts product that we see at the end of it all. Whenever I can find any behind the scenes devlogs or tech talk or anything for one of my favorite games, it's finding treasure. It gives you such an insight into the process, helps you deconstruct these games that we all hold on pedestals, and you know makes you appreciate the effort that goes into every little detail so much more, especially for a solo game dev. And that's really, I think, why Return of the Obra Dinn stands out so much to me, is that the attention to details in the game is amazing. And I've just ranted about the graphical style of the game so far without saying anything about the gameplay. But that attention to detail is kind of the gameplay hook as well. Like I mentioned at the top, it's a deduction game where you walk around this abandoned ship from a first-person perspective. You've got 60 people in the cruise ship log, and you need to assign identities to each of them. When you find a corpse, you use your magic pocket watch, and you get transported into this 3D freeze frame scene of that person's death where you can walk around and investigate, check out the environment, see who else was there at the time of the death, see who may have perpetrated the murder if it was indeed a murder. And then you have to use all these little details to figure out who this person was and how they died. And when I say you have to use all of the details, I mean you have to use all of the details. As you progress through the game, you'll start to piece together more of the narrative as you see these different death scenes. And it'll start off easy, but as you keep going, the identities get more and more challenging to figure out. You have a book that you can reference that contains a bunch of other details to use. It's got a list of every crew member along with their role and nationality. It's got a map of the voyage that the ship took. It's got a map of the ship itself with labels for all the different areas of the ship. It's got an artist's sketch of just a day in the life of the crew members interacting with each other. And then it's got, at the back of the book, a glossary of different nautical terms that you might need to know, like, say, the difference between a helmsman and a midshipman. And what makes Return of the Obra Dinn so good as a deduction game, in my opinion, is not that it's necessarily, challenging or hard, but that it just uses every dimension of information in these puzzles. A clue to someone's identity may or may not be deduced through basically any piece of information at your disposal. And when the game nudges you to make a leap of logic that ends up working out, it just makes you feel like an absolute genius when you use all these different layers of information to piece something together. It also doesn't require perfection from the player, which I think is important to mention. You don't necessarily have to get every guess completely correct. There's a really intelligent mechanic, I think, where the game will validate your guesses in batches of 3. So if you're absolutely certain about 2 identities, but maybe a little bit iffy about the third, you can guess and check to try and lock in that third identity, or plug in a couple different identities that you're maybe waffling between to try and lock it in. There's a bit of leeway there, right? And you don't have to do that. You can only put in identities into the book that you have found a clue to deduce and that you're certain about. Every identity can be deduced in one way or another. If you want to make it hard for yourself, you can not do that kind of guess and checking. But if you want to make it a little bit easier, you can do it, which I always really appreciate games that allow for that kind of self-selection of difficulty. It just feels so much more organic than something like an explicit difficulty selection screen where you're going to pick easy, normal, or hard when you first start the game. There are just so many other details that I could talk about in this game. The music, the voice acting that plays when a death scene starts, all the audio design when you're walking around the ship, And then just down to the absolute tiniest things like the music notes that play when you click through the tutorial, or the way that the pictures in the book will fade in, or just the incredibly satisfying well done message that you get when you solve 3 fates. And since I'm keeping this episode spoiler free, I can't even begin to talk about all the really cool deductive puzzles that you have to figure out, or even just like the narrative of what happens to the Obra Dinn, which I found really cool to kind of learn about through these death scenes. Anyway, that's my rant on Return of the Obra Dinn. I absolutely adore this game. I think it's fantastic. I can't wait to see what other games Lucas Pope comes up with in the future. He always has such a unique vision for a game and just creates stuff that you really don't see anywhere else. So thanks for listening and happy gaming, everybody.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
And Jacob McCord.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers
and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.